The night a billionaire screamed at me for dancing with his autistic daughter, I honestly thought I was about to get fired in front of 200 rich people. 5 minutes later, I was on the floor, with my head bleeding, and pieces of his chandelier all around us. And somehow, that was the moment my whole life changed, even though I didn't know it yet. My name is Maya Williams. I was 29, and at that time I was just the help at the Donovan estate outside Charleston, South Carolina. Black uniform, polished shoes that hurt my feet, and a job description that basically boiled down to this: serve, nod, disappear. That night was one of Julian Donovan's big charity galas, the kind where the marble floors are polished so hard they shine like water. Violins are playing in the corner, and everyone smells like expensive perfume and old money. You know what I mean? The whole place buzzing with polished laughter and clinking glasses. And in the middle of all that noise, I saw her. She was tucked into a dark corner by the tall windows, this tiny 5-year-old girl in a cream dress, knees pulled up, winding the silver handle of a little music box over and over, like it was the only thing tethering her to the room. No one talking to her, no one even looking at her. Every time the ballroom doors opened, warm spring air from the garden floated in. People swayed and flirted and made deals, and that little girl just stared at the dancers, eyes locked on the swirl of gowns and suits, like she wanted to step into that world, but her feet were glued to the carpet. A drunk guest staggered past me, reeking of whiskey, pointed his glass toward the corner, and said way too loud to his friend, "Look at that poor thing's off, doesn't even belong in a place like this." Then laughed like it was some kind of joke, and the words hit me harder than the smell of his drink, because I had heard that tone my whole life. Too much, too loud, too black, too different, too poor for certain rooms. I saw the girl's shoulders stiffen. Her hands clutched the music box tighter. She didn't cry, didn't speak. She just folded in on herself like she was trying to disappear. I was supposed to keep moving with my tray, pretend I hadn't heard anything, but something in me just said, enough. I set the tray down on a side table, wiped my palms on my apron, and walked straight toward her. I remember kneeling so I wouldn't tower over her, my heart beating way too loud, and I said softly, "Hey, sweetheart, do you like to dance?" She didn't answer, didn't even look at me at first, just kept her gaze locked on the couples spinning under the chandelier. But the crank of the music box slowed a little, and after a few seconds, she tilted her head just enough that I could see her eyes big and blue and full of the kind of lonely a 5-year-old should never know. I held my hand out, not touching, just offering. "We don't have to go into that big crowd. We can just stand up here, you and me, in our own little corner. If you'd like," my voice shaking a little, because it felt like I was breaking some invisible rule of that house. She hesitated, tiny fingers flexing around the music box. Then she placed her hand in mine, so careful, like she was afraid I might vanish if she moved too fast. And that was the moment I decided I didn't care what the staff handbook said. This child was not going to spend the whole night as furniture. We stepped out of the shadow, just enough to feel the music far from the center of the room, but close enough that the rhythm of the waltz reached us. I didn't try to teach her real steps. I just swayed side to side, slow and predictable, letting her feel what it was like to have someone move with her instead of around her. At first, her feet were stiff, eyes glued to the floor. But then her right foot slid half an inch, then another. Her shoulder leaned the tiniest bit toward me like she was asking, "Is this okay?" And I whispered, "It's perfect, Ava," because by then I'd heard someone say her name. What I didn't notice until too late was that the whole ballroom had gone quiet. Conversations faded, glasses lowered, even the musicians softened, like the room was holding its breath. And at the far end, I saw him. Julian Donovan, 40-something tall, tailored the kind of man whose picture ends up in business magazines, standing frozen with his drink in his hand, staring at us like he'd seen a ghost. Later, I found out why. It wasn't just that I was dancing with his daughter. It was the way I was moving, the way I held my arms, the way my wrists softened at the ends of the phrases, the quiet rise and fall of my breathing. To him, I wasn't just Maya the maid. I was a mirror of his late wife, Grace Donovan. His ballerina, my old friend, the woman whose funeral I'd stood at in the back row, promising myself that if her little girl ever needed me somehow, I would find a way to be there. His face twisted grief and anger and panic all at once, and then his voice cracked across the room, sharp and hard. Ava flinched violently, dropping the music box, hands flying to her ears, my own body locked up from the shock of it, and he started marching across the floor, guests pulling back to clear his path. "Get away from her," he snapped at me, eyes wild. "Don't you ever bring that into my home again. Do you understand me?" The whole room was staring, waiting for me to shrink, apologize, disappear, and I started to say, "I'm sorry, sir, I didn't mean." But before I could finish, there was a loud crack overhead. Somebody gasped. I looked up and I saw it. A small section of the chandelier loosened by age or vibration, or maybe just fate breaking loose, glittering shards of crystal tumbling straight toward the little girl beside me. In moments like that, you don't think your body just moves all those years in the studio with Grace, all those if I fall. You catch me rehearsals. They kicked in before my brain could scream. I lunged, shoved Ava out of the fall line, and threw myself over her, curling my body into a shield. Glass rained down, one shard slicing across my temple, hot pain flashing, and then dulling the sound of people screaming, and chairs scraping, and the music screeching to a halt. I stayed there until the last piece hit the floor, until it was quiet enough that I knew she wasn't being hit anymore. When I finally rolled off her, the room was spinning, my vision blurred at the edges, but I saw her looking up at me with wide, trembling eyes, not scared of me, just taking me in, like her brain had finally matched my body to something she knew. I tried to smile. "You're okay, sweetheart." I whispered, my fingers coming away sticky with blood, when I touched my head, and the chandelier lights smeared into golden streaks before everything went black. When I woke up, I was in a bed I definitely didn't own, pale cream ceiling, soft linen sheets, the smell of antiseptic and lavender, my head pounding like a drum, stitches pulling at my temple every time I moved. Mrs. Grafton, the head housekeeper that was sitting in a chair, with that look older women in big houses get, when they're half angry, half worried. "You're lucky," she said. "If that piece had hit an inch lower, you might not be here to argue with Mr. Donovan." I croaked out, "How long was I out?" And she said, "Almost 10 hours. Doctor says concussion, 4 stitches. Then she softened just a little and added, "That girl of his barely left your side. She held your hand until she passed out in the chair. We had to pry her fingers off you." That part almost made me cry more than the pain. See, years before any of this, I'd known Grace. We'd been partners in a small, modern ballet company, sweating side by side in studios with bad air conditioning, laughing through blisters and missed cues, trading secrets about love and fear and how badly we both wanted to matter. She was the one who would spin across the floor like light itself. I was the one who grounded her, caught her. If she stumbled, walked her home when she was too tired to stand. When she married Julian and stepped into this world of boardrooms and galas, I stayed behind, kept teaching, kept scraping by, blew out my knee, lost my shot at the stage, and then one day I got the call that there had been an accident, that Grace was gone, and I stood in the back of that sunlit chapel thinking, if her girl ever needs me, please God, show me how to show up. Lying there in that guest wing, bandages on my hands from catching glass, I started to wonder if this was the answer. Later that morning, Julian showed up in my doorway, not knocking, just standing there, like a man who wasn't sure he had the right to enter his own house. Gone was the perfect tux, his tie was missing. Sleeves rolled, hair messed up. He looked less like a billionaire and more like someone's exhausted dad. I sat up, heart-hammering Mr. Donovan about last night. I'm sorry I wasn't trying to upset you. I just saw her sitting alone and... He lifted a hand, cut me off, his voice rough. Don't apologize, you saved her. There is no version of this conversation where you apologize first. That alone almost knocked me over. He took a breath, sat in the chair, scrubbed a hand over his face. When I saw you dancing with Ava, he said, I didn't just see her. I saw Grace, the way you held your arms, the way you breathed. It was like she was in the room again, and I panicked. I've spent years boxing up anything that reminded me of her. I thought if I buried it, it would protect Ava, protect me, but it didn't. It just sat there like a landmine waiting to go off. I told him quietly that Grace and I had been partners for nearly 4 years, that we'd done late-night rehearsals and giggled through failures that she used to say, if I die on stage, at least I went doing what I love. And if I die off stage, find my kid and make sure she dances when she wants to, not because someone expects her to. And I watched that hit him. He finally asked, why did you go to Ava that night? And I told the truth. Because no one else did. And because she was watching the dancers the way Grace used to watch the stage, before going on like the music was the only part of the world that made sense. There was a long pause, then he said, you're the first person she's ever reached back for, like that I don't want you to leave. Not just as staff, I want you to stay as her companion, her guide if you're willing. I said I would stay, but only if Ava wanted me to, and right then we both heard a small sound at the doorway. Ava was standing there, wrapped in a pink blanket music box, clutched in her hands. She didn't speak, just looked straight at me and gave this tiny, serious nod. That was my yes. The weeks after that were slow and awkward and strangely holy. I traded my black uniform for soft blouses and slacks, courtesy of Mrs. Grafton grumbling, you're not staff now, not exactly. You're something else, and I started learning the rhythms of the Donovan estate when it wasn't full of guests. Mornings were quiet, the kind of quiet that isn't peaceful but heavy, like everyone is trying not to wake a sleeping ghost. Doors closed softly, staff spoke in low voices, even the grandfather clock seemed to tick more gently. And in the sunroom, bathed in light but completely empty of toys or photos, Ava sat on the rug with her music box, tracing invisible shapes on the floor, humming sometimes under her breath. I realized fast that words had never worked for her, not the way adults wanted them to, but movement rhythm that was something else entirely. So I started small, turned the sunroom into a kind of private studio, laid out a mat, put on soft, unfamiliar music so it wouldn't trigger old trauma, and made up our own language. One slow sweep of my arms meant good morning. A little twirl meant I'm happy right now. 2 taps of my foot meant yes, a soft shoulder roll meant maybe a gentle step back meant not ready. For days, she just watched eyes flicking between my feet and my hands, memorizing patterns. And then one morning, she lifted her hand and copied the curve of my wrist, tiny and awkward, and absolutely beautiful. I wanted to scream and cry and call every specialist who said she was unreachable and say, look what you missed. Instead, I just smiled and whispered, beautiful Ava, that's it. And we kept going. Somewhere in the middle of this, Julian started walking by the sunroom more often, sometimes pretending to be on a work call, sometimes just leaning in the doorway, watching his daughter's body start to speak. I could feel his guilt from across the room, I should have done more. I should have learned this sooner. And I'd catch his eye now and then, and shake my head a little, like we're here now, that's what matters. Not everyone was on board. There was a man named Robert Langston, an investor, and old friend of Julian's father, who had opinions about everything that happened in that house, especially when it came to the family trust. One rainy afternoon, I heard him in the study, voice sharp. "She is a maid, Julian, not a therapist, not a teacher, and certainly not fit to have this much influence over an heir. This is reckless. What are the courts going to say when they see you've let some former dancer from nowhere become the most important person in that child's life?" I was in the hallway with a laundry basket, listening with my stomach tied in knots. I heard Julian say, "She's not some former dancer. She's the only one who's reached Ava." And I heard Robert say, "You're thinking with your grief, not your head. If you keep this up, someone is going to challenge your fitness as a guardian. And when they do, you'll lose more than a board seat." Those words turned out to be prophecy. But before that storm hit, we had a different kind of turning point. I found a date lightly circled on the kitchen calendar, April 18th. No notes. Nothing written except a faint indentation. And when I asked Mrs. Grafton about it, she said, "That was Grace's favorite day of the year. Ava's birthday. She used to plan it for months now. Mr. Donovan pretends it's just another day, says Ava doesn't notice. The night before, Ava was restless in the sunroom, rocking slightly, fingers fluttering against her collarbone in a tight pattern, and I sat beside her and said, 'You know what tomorrow is, sweetheart? It's your birthday, your day.' She went still, not in a bad way, more like she was listening hard. I made her a tiny crown out of felt from the sewing drawer, not much, but it was something that said, 'You have a right to be celebrated,' and I told her, 'We don't have to do anything big, just a little dance, just us.' That night I sneaked into Grace's old studio, which had been locked for years, but somehow not anymore, strung up. A few fairy lights swept the dust, unrolled a practice mat, put a picture of Grace on the window ledge and whispered, 'Help me make this good.' The next morning, Ava came downstairs, wearing the crown, clutching her music box. And when I asked, "You remembered," she didn't answer with words, just took my hand. We went out to the garden where I'd set a small table with 2 cupcakes and lemonade turned on a simple waltz and said, "No rules, just us." I twirled once slowly, and she followed. Then again, and she spun too fast, stumbled, and this little burst of laughter came out of her hesitant and bright, and so new I almost dropped my own feet. I laughed too, not because it was funny, but because joy is contagious, and on the terrace Julian watched his daughter laugh for the first time in years, his face breaking open in quiet tears. That was one of the best days of my life. A few weeks later, the worst letter showed up. Robert made good on his threat, filed a formal challenge to Julian's guardianship on behalf of the Donovan Family Trust, claiming he was allowing me, a non-relative formerly employed as domestic staff, to exert undue emotional influence over a vulnerable child and jeopardize her financial future. Translation: This black woman from outside the gates is getting too close, and we don't like what that looks like on paper. I was furious and terrified at the same time. I've been underestimated my entire life, but having my love for that little girl twisted into some kind of threat that hit different. Courtrooms are cold in a way air conditioning can't explain. The day of the hearing, I sat at the front table next to Julie and Ava between us, holding my scarf like a lifeline, while Robert sat across the aisle with his lawyers in perfect suits, whispering, like this was just another negotiation. The judge, a woman with short gray hair and tired eyes, read the case, then listened, as Robert's attorney listed every degree I didn't have. Every line on my employment history that proved I was unqualified talked about liability, optics, bloodlines, all the things people like that care about. Julian spoke about nights with therapists and specialists, and how none of them reached his daughter the way I had, how he'd watched her body speak when her mouth wouldn't, and then it was my turn. I stood up with my heart in my throat and told the judge I was not hired to be a mother, that I'd come into that house to serve canapes, and smile that the only reason I crossed that ballroom was because I saw a child being treated like furniture, and I couldn't unsee it that I spoke to her in the only language that ever made sense to me: movement. And she answered not because I'm special, but because I didn't ask her to be different to deserve kindness. I told her I'd learned to read silence the hard way, as a kid who was always the wrong thing in the wrong place, and that maybe that was exactly why Ava trusted me. The lawyer tried to paint it as emotional manipulation, said love is not a qualification, Your Honor. And the judge raised an eyebrow like she wanted to say, "Then what are we doing here?" Then she did something none of us expected. She asked if Ava wanted to say anything. The whole room held its breath. Ava hates crowds, hates loud noises, but she let go of my hand, slid off her chair, walked up to the bench with her little shoulders shaking, took my scarf from around her neck, and laid it on the judge's desk. "This is mine," she said, voice small but steady. She gave it to me so I feel safe. She knows my music. I felt my knees go weak. The judge looked from the scarf to Ava to me and asked, "Do you feel safe with Miss Williams?" And Ava nodded, no hesitation. She listens when I don't talk. Yeah, that happened. The judge banged the gavel and threw out Robert's challenge, confirmed Julian's guardianship, and legally named me as Ava's guardian if anything ever happened to him, and she made it very clear that this child was not a trust fund, not an asset, but a human being whose sense of belonging mattered more than any bloodline or balance sheet. Walking out of that courthouse, Ava's hand in mine, Julian on the other side, cameras flashing, reporters calling me the maid who became a guardian. I felt this strange mix of pride and anger, because on one hand we'd won, on the other hand, I knew there were a million families without money, or video evidence, or sympathetic judges who would never get that chance. A lot has happened since then, more than I can fit in one story. Letters from Grace that Julian had been too broken to open footage of her at a gala looking right into the camera and saying that if anything happened to her, she wanted me near her daughter. The studio we rebuilt in her name where kids like Ava come to move however they need to. The quiet mornings where Ava now pads into my room, curls up under my blanket, and whispers whole sentences like, "Can we have pancakes today?" But when I look back, I know it all started in that corner of that ballroom, when I decided not to walk past a child being ignored. So now I want to ask you this, and I really want you to answer in the comments. Do you think the judge made the right call, letting a maid become a legal guardian when there were rich relatives and lawyers lined up to take control? Do you think a mother has the right to choose a friend over blood? In a letter, do you think a non-verbal autistic girl should be trusted when she says, "This is my family," even if it doesn't look like what society expects? And on a more personal note, have you ever watched someone be written off because of their job, their race, their diagnosis, their bank account, while the person who actually showed up and stayed got treated like they didn't belong at the table? Tell me what you think is fair. Tell me if you've lived something like this. Like if you want more people to hear Ava's story, and drop a comment. In your eyes, who really defines family here? The man with the money, the court with the papers, or the little girl in the corner who just needed someone to ask, "Do you like to dance?"